or another, they came into contact with missionaries who began to teach them the message of the restored gospel. And as a result of that message, they had the faith and the humility to respond to it in a way that led them to baptism and confirmation into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And speaking for all of the members who have joined us tonight who are lifetime members, which I am, and my wife, Sister Christensen, we are both lifetime members. But when we get to hear the testimonies of a recent convert and of the courage and the faith and the sacrifice that they made, we are inspired. Sometimes I think they think that they look to us for examples, and maybe they do to some extent, but we look to them for inspiration to continue to live the lives that we all desire to live, to pattern our lives more after the Savior Jesus Christ. So with that, we are going to turn some time over to a young man by the name of Cody Ellison, who lives out in the Tahlequah area out east, and he will share with us his story. Cody, over to you.
Hey, can everyone hear me okay? Is my mic working?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, all right, great. Well, I actually am, as you said, a new convert to the church. I actually got my baptism done. I believe it was the 26th that I was baptized, and it is a very memorable moment. But I'm here to kind of share my story about how I got there, and hopefully you'll forgive me because this is only my second testimony ever. So bear with me a little bit here. But and as I said in my initial testimony in my ward, in order for everyone to really understand, I guess, the magnitude of my decision to get baptized and join the church, in order to understand how I got to the church, I really want people to know where I came from the church, and not physically, but spiritually, because a lot of people get the impression that most converts had never heard of God before they chose to join the church. And in my case, I actually grew up in a Christian family. Most of them are Protestants. A few of them are culturally Catholics, not quite practicing. But I grew up in a Christian household, in a Christian family. But when I was younger, I actually I didn't consider myself a Christian at the time. And there's several reasons. I was really pessimistic about the world, as I think that a lot of younger people are these days. But one of the, I guess, really a good example of one of the reasons why is because when I was younger, for example, I suffered a lot from night terrors. I had really bad nightmares, and I would see spiders and aliens and goblins and demons and all sorts of stuff in my sleep. And I remember my mom, who she read the Bible every single day, kind of person. And she told me, well, pray to God and God will save you, you know. And so the next time I found myself being trapped in these nightmares, literally trapped, like I would try to wake up myself from the dreams, and these nightmares would not allow me to wake up. They would be trapping me in my own dream. And so she said, pray to God and he'll save you. And I was probably about 7 or 8 years old at the time. But that's what I did. I prayed to God, and a lot of people won't like this part of my story, but I promise you it has a good ending. When I had prayed to God at that point in time to save me from these demons, he didn't come. And like I said, a lot of people don't like that. They don't like to hear that, but that's what happened when I was about 7, 8 years old. I prayed to God and he didn't come and save me. I was left to fight these demons on my own. And so that kind of led me on a track of for several years, actually searching through other religions, because I thought, well, if this God won't help me, then I'll find one who will, And so I spent several years, and this is the reason why I want to say this, is because I want a lot of people to know that this isn't just the first religion I'd heard of, and it's the one I went with. Actually, I was born into it, decided not to follow it, and then began looking for other deities to help me with my problems. I tried looking into all sorts of religions, from Wicca, heathenism, worship of the Norse gods. I didn't actively worship, but I did a lot of research into these deities. I tried Taoism, Buddhism, I looked at all these different religions, and as far as the deific religions go, the problem that I always found with these other gods that other religions worship was that once I got really digging into the character of these deities and their actions and their history, I'd come to find out that a lot of these deities had a even worse track record than what I had considered the Christian God to have. And so I eventually, ironically enough, I went back to the Bible and began studying because someone told me, well, maybe you're looking at the wrong religions. Just go back and read the Bible, and believe me, you'll like it. You just got to read what's inside. And again, a lot of people won't like this part of my testimony either, but I promise you it has a good ending because I'm part of the church now. I went back and read the Bible, and ironically enough, despite reading the Bible, I wouldn't say I read every single word, but I read most of it. And I actually didn't like what I heard. When I had read the Bible at that point in my life, it made me see God as a tyrant. And so, ironically enough, after having read the Bible and explored these other religions, I found myself turning to Luciferianism, which is a whole nother story in and of itself. But this talk is about joining the Church of Jesus Christ, so I'll save the details of that for another time. I found a home kind of in Luciferianism, and for about 7 or 8 years, actually, I considered myself a Luciferian for most of my current life because I'm only 26. And I actually spent a good long while on that before I came to realize that I'll say this: the thing about the last faith I was considering myself a part of, Luciferianism, is unlike other faiths that want you to worship a god in exchange for favors or blessings or help in some way. The Luciferian practice was that you had to do things yourself, that you were set free, and now it's up to you to do what you will with that freedom. You have to choose your own fate. And so, even in the end of the day, for a long time, I'd kind of resigned myself to the idea that no one was going to help me, and that I may as well, in a sense, worship a deity who taught you to rely on yourself as opposed to asking for help from someone else, since I wasn't receiving help from anyone else, at least no spiritual help anyway. And so that's where I found myself for several years. But to be honest with you, I really couldn't do it myself. Life was very difficult. I couldn't find work. I couldn't find someone to care for, who cared about me. I was being betrayed left and right by the friends I was hanging out with, and I couldn't find the motivation to do anything that I knew I needed to do. And so, at the end of the day, even a God who told you to rely on yourself still wasn't good enough. And so, it was around that time I started looking into spiritualism a little bit more again, and I'd come across the words of Jordan Peterson, actually. And if anyone here hasn't heard of Jordan Peterson and they're still thinking through how they feel about Christianity or about the church in general, I'd strongly recommend for them. And this is not sponsored, by the way, this is just coming out of my head, but they should really check out Jordan Peterson's bibliography series, where he goes through the Bible from the perspective of a psychologist. And that really helped me look at the Bible in a whole new way, because I think that one thing a lot of people who are born into the church may not comprehend is that people who aren't born in the church don't speak the same language. We both speak English, or we both speak Spanish, or whatever, but the words that are in the Bible and the words that the Christians and culture use are words that people in modern culture don't generally use that much. And so when a psychologist broke the Bible down in terms that I could understand as a modern person, it was almost like he was speaking my language as opposed to the language of the church, which I didn't understand at the time. It took a psychologist to get me to reread the Bible and read the exact same words that I had previously read through and convinced myself that God was a tyrant. I read through these exact same words again and saw miraculously a merciful and forgiving God. And so, Jordan Peterson's work really completely changed my perspective on the Bible and on God in general. And so I'd really recommend that to anyone who's still struggling with their faith. But after I had read his works, I said, okay, well, now I'm more okay with the idea of God. I still thought he was a bit harsh. And so at that point in my life, I said, well, I don't really get along with God so much, but I do really like the idea of Jesus. And so I'm going to focus on Jesus. I'll look more into Jesus. And that's when I started reading the scriptures a bit more and actually trying to communicate with God again. And because people had always told me, pray and you'll get an answer. The problem was, I feel like a lot of people feel this way. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but in a sense, I was praying, I was asking questions at the time, and I still wasn't receiving any answers. And interestingly enough, this is about, and I'll leave the politics out of this, but you'll have to forgive me because where I found God was in the backdrop of a political conflict. So I'll try and leave the labels aside and just kind of give you the spiritual essence of what I experienced. But I went to Washington D.C. on January 6th because I figured, if there's God's not listening to me, but if there's one place I could get his attention, it'd be at the center of the free world on the day where the leader of the free world at the time called the people of his country to be there. So I said, I don't know what's happening that day, but that seems like a pretty important day. And if there's anywhere that God will be looking on this planet that I know I'll be able to get his attention, it's there in the center of the free world. So that's where I went. I spent over $1,000. And at the time, I was only making $9 an hour, $10 an hour at the job I was working at. And so anybody who's ever worked a minimum wage job can attest to how difficult it is to come across $1,000. But fortunately, I had some holiday pay. My bills weren't that high at the time, and I managed to scrape together the money. Now, I went into debt for about 3 or 4 months afterwards, and I only recently recovered from that trip. But I mustered $1,000 to go there and pay for the tickets and the hotel and all that stuff. And I had got there, and I had actually I had very little money. So when I had bought the tickets to DC and I landed in the airport, I actually hiked with my feet for 4.5 miles into the city because I couldn't afford a taxi. So when I landed in the city, I spent my trip in there and the whole 4 days I was in there walking everywhere I went. I probably walked 7 to 10 miles in any given direction multiple times a day. And throughout my time in the city, there were Christians from all over the country in attendance, from every state you could possibly imagine, from every denomination you can imagine, waving Christian flags and hoisting up big, massive, giant wooden crosses at various events. And some of the things that I saw there were really, really opening my eyes to the fact that maybe God really is, like, well, I came there to find God, and I was seeing example after example that he was there in some way, from the millions of people holding crosses and flags with crosses on them to a few small examples. Like I'm Cherokee, right? And when I was in Washington D.C., I came across another Cherokee tribal member, and we're in Washington D.C., so we're the only two Cherokees in the whole city. So you know what I mean? It was kind of a kind of, we had something in common, and he just so happened to be a Hebrew priest talking about how the ancient Native Americans could trace their lineage back to the Middle East, and anyone who's read the Book of Mormon, that sounds about right, and I had never heard of the Book of Mormon at the time, not in the proper context anyway. But I had met a Hebrew priest from the tribe of Israel who told me about the Native American history from ancestors in the Holy Land. I met a guy named Doug who testified that he believed that God told him to literally bear a cross through the streets of Washington, D.C. And so there Doug was, this guy from somewhere else in the United States who had carried one of the people who had brought big, giant, massive crosses. His wooden cross was about 15 feet tall and 6 or 7 feet wide. And he wheeled it through the streets on a bicycle, carrying that giant cross, and he outpaced us all carrying that giant cross, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, because I mean, it was a pretty big cross, and he wasn't like hopping on his bike and speeding down the road. He was like, he had it on his bike and he was walking it through the streets. He wasn't riding on the wheels, so it was quite an amazing feat of display of faith that he was able to outpace everyone with that giant cross on his back. And before we had left to the first event, the Hebrew priest that I had met there, I can't remember, his name was Sean, but at the time, none of us knew each other's names, so we just called him the priest. I was Oklahoma, he was the priest. We had another friend. We called each other by where we were from or some sort of other characteristic. But yeah, so I came across a few interesting things there. And then after the big event, I'll say for those who aren't politically inclined, um, after the whole thing that happened at the Capitol building, we had all gone back to our hotel rooms, and we're talking about stories where people from the other side of the political and cultural divide had taken to the streets and had begun harassing people who had come to the city. And it was actually at that point in harassment where we were threatened with violence, and one of them tried to pull a gun on us, and we had retreated back into our hotel rooms. And at the time, I had still smoked, and most of the people there smoked. It was, we were living in one of the most corrupt cities in the country, so it was a pretty stressful situation. We were still smokers. This was before I joined the church and decided to quit smoking. We decided we're going to go find somewhere to have a cigarette. And outside in the streets, we were quite literally being persecuted against people who disagreed with us for our beliefs. And so we couldn't smoke inside the building either. So we actually went underground to a underground parking garage, where we ended up talking for 4.5 hours about God and the latter days and prophecies and prophets and the meaning of scripture in general. And we'd known each other for a few days, and there we were talking about scripture with these strangers, but nothing, fellow Christians in an underground area fleeing persecution, much like the early Christians did from the Romans. They would have to preach and do their ceremonies in caves and stuff. And so, I kind of, in a way, got a small taste of what the first Christians had felt, just a small taste. And so I said, I with all these things happening during my time in DC, I kind of felt a lot of proof, firsthand proof that God was still on this earth in some way, and that, the struggles of his people were still going on in some way, that there were millions of other people who had been called there the same way, what they believed by God. And so while I was in the city, it wasn't just adversaries that had challenged us physically. There was also persecution from the powers that be. Anyone who watches the news, like I said, I'll keep my politics out of it, but there was persecution from the powers that be, as well as personal challenges. When I was in Washington, D.C., I actually only had a few $100s left for food and expenses in the city. And on my second day there, the bills had come due here back home 1,000 miles away. And all of my money was going to be taken, and I would have been left in the city with nothing to survive on for 3 days. And see, at this point in time, I had already come around to looking at the Bible in a new way. And this is where my story from the beginning about my nightmares comes in. When I said that God hadn't come to save me when I was real young, when I was in the streets of DC and I had realized that I would have no money because bills were coming due, I called to God by the only name that I knew him at the time, which was Yahweh. And I said, Yahweh, I know that we haven't always gotten along in the past, but if you're willing to forgive me, I'll forgive you. And if you can just help me get back home safe, I promise I'll start going to church. And so I actually walked another 3.5 miles through the streets of the city. And my bills were supposed to have already come due. I had gotten the notification saying that they were all due and that they were going to be taken out automatically, because I had all the bills automated at the time. But somehow, an hour and a half past time when it was due for my bills to be drawn, I had made it 4.5 miles to the nearest ATM, and my money was somehow still inside my account. And so I withdrew it to survive on for the next few days, and made it through the city safely back home. I took a flight back home. And so if it wasn't for God answering my prayers in that moment, I could have very well been stranded in DC with no food and no money, no family and no friends. But because he had answered my prayers, I made it back home safe and sound. And when I came back home, the first thing I thought to myself as well, I told him I would start going to church if he answered my prayer. So I guess now I have to start going to church. And so I started looking for churches. And I know this is running long, but I promise you it's almost over. We're getting to the good part. you know, but I had looking for churches. And so not only did I spend a great deal of time looking at the Bible and other religions, and a great deal of time as a Luciferian, walking with the adversary himself, so to speak. But uh, I had spent several time looking for various local churches. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to criticize, other Christians. But I had went through about 4 or 5 different churches in my area, and without naming names, none of them, like, despite after finally coming around to the scriptures and reading the Bible in a new light, and then deciding, okay, I will go to church, I'll worship God. Now I need to find the right church. And I went to 3 or 4 different churches, and in one way or another, they weren't following scripture, or that maybe they were for the most part, but the people who were there weren't living the scripture. They weren't living by the practices they preached. For one reason or another, these churches just weren't right. They just didn't fit me. And I had actually just about given up the search for a church. It was at the point where I was praying, and I said, okay, you know what, God, I looked for a church. I went to a few churches. I can't find one that fits me. I'm sorry, but hopefully you'll just accept that, I can pray to you and read the Bible, and maybe there is no right church anymore. And it was right about that time where I had actually saw a Facebook post from the Native American disciples of Jesus Christ. And I know it sounds a bit cliche, but I thought, oh, well, I'm an Indian. There's Jesus standing next to an Indian. That looks kind of cool. We'll see what these guys have to say. The Hebrew priest back in DC told me that Native Americans had biblical ancestry. A lot of Cherokees around here will tell you that they believe that they came from the ancient Israelites in one way or another, a lost tribe of Israel. So I said, yeah, okay, let's see what this is about. And I answered one of their messages, and the question that they had asked me on the post was, how do you protect yourself from the influence of the adversary? And I had answered the post at the time, being a waning Luciferian. I'd answered the post, well, I don't, and the answer that I provided was, I don't protect myself from the influence of the adversary. I walk with him and speak with him about the words of God in hopes that we may both better understand them. And I guess it struck a chord with the missionaries who were running the page, because they reached out to me and said, hey, really, really like what you had to say, and we want to do a video call with you. Is that okay? And I said yes. And so that was my first meeting with the missionaries, where they told me, hey, we're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'd messaged them for a little while, talked with them over the phone for a little bit, and I told them about my journey. I told them, you know what, I'm finally opening up to the idea of Christianity, but I've been to a few churches at this point, and now other Christians are telling me that I'm not a real Christian. So I need to know, do you guys think I'm a real Christian, or are they not real Christians? And they said, well, we can't speak for them, but based on what you've told us so far, you seem like you're Christian enough to us. Why don't you come down and check out our church? We can drop off a Book of Mormon. And that was the first time I'd heard the word Mormon from them. And at this point, the only thing I knew about Mormons were pulp culture sarcastic jokes about people riding around in bikes and hats and ties and worshiping Joseph Smith. So I said, well, hang on just a second, you're Mormons? I don't know about that. And I said, no, it's not what you think. Just come down to our church and, just see how it is. We'll talk about it. We'll explain everything. We don't worship Joseph Smith. We don't believe that prophets have magical powers. We'll explain everything to you. And I said, okay, and I came down to the church, and it was a really nice service. It wasn't over the top. It wasn't highly overly decorative. A lot of the churches that I'd been to, they had shiny golden crosses and tapestries and fabrics and all sorts of different pictures and paintings and jewelry all over the place. And I went to the church, and I noticed the first thing I thought was, wow, the fanciest thing in this room is the people. This must be a church of the people instead of a church of idols, of golden crosses and altars. This must be a church of the people. And so I sat there for the service, listened to some people provide their testimonies. And when I saw that it was just a bunch of people talking about their understanding of the Bible and what it means to them, and the miracles they'd experienced in their life, that they had, much like I had discovered at this point that I had, they had testimonies of a living God, of miracles and of divine influence occurring to this day. Whereas all the other churches I'd went to prophesized that the days of divine intervention were done and over with. You know, so I turned to my missionaries and I said, okay, you know what? This church service was pretty good. I'll go ahead and take one of those books of Mormon now. And so they said, okay, here you go. And they gave me a Book of Mormon, and I started studying it. And this is at the point where the most important question that held me back from finally deciding, okay, this is the right church. I'm going to join the Church of Latter-day Saints. Though the one thing that held me back, I looked at scripture, I looked at the Bible, I'd changed my heart on God and on Jesus. The church seemed like it was a good church. The scriptures seemed like they were being followed. But the one question that I was still wrestling with, and I think a lot of converts may have experienced this at some point in their journey, is, do I believe Joseph Smith? Do I believe Joseph Smith was a prophet and that he was telling the truth? And so I looked into the life and history of Joseph Smith, the early history of the church, and I remember I spent about 2 months dragging the missionaries along, and they were like, yeah, when are you going to get baptized? And I'd spent 2 months putting it off. So the missionaries who were working with me were actually very patient. But I spent 2 months, looking into the Book of Mormon, looking into the church, looking into the story of Joseph Smith. And even after all the research I had done through the gospel library, through the church's own documents, I still couldn't decide whether or not I believed Joseph Smith. And the only answer I could find up to this point was, well, just pray on it. And, God will tell you whether or not it's true. And, and that's a fine answer and everything, and it might be good enough for some people, but it was right about the time. So I said, okay, well, I'll pray to God, and see, is this really the true church? Was Joseph Smith telling the truth? And it was right about that time where someone introduced me to the current prophet of the church, Russell Nelson, and his conference. I can't remember the exact name of the conference, but it's the one where he spoke about overcoming mountains and the mustard seed. And somewhere in that conference, he had mentioned Joseph Smith, and he had talked about, he had actually asked the very same question that I was asking myself at that moment was, do you believe Joseph Smith? And what he said one sentence that had cleared up months of investigation for me. And what he said was that Joseph Smith died for what he believed. If Joseph Smith wasn't telling the truth, would he have sacrificed his life for what he believed? And that one sentence, that one question cleared it up for me, because I thought, you know what? That's right. If Joseph Smith was lying, he wouldn't have sacrificed himself. Everyone claims he's a con man, but what kind of con man sacrifices his life for his con? A con man skips town the moment he's found out and tries his con again somewhere else. And so when Russell Nelson said, well, he sacrificed his life for his belief, I said, you know what? That's it. If someone's willing to sacrifice their life for what they believe, then I can believe what they have to say. And so that was the defining moment where I said, okay, you know what? I believe in Joseph Smith. I believe what he had to say was true. And at that same moment, when I felt relief for finally putting together all the pieces, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel a little bit shameful, because it took his death to convince me that he was right, and I felt a little bit shameful, because I shouldn't require someone's blood, someone's life to prove what they believe. I should have more trust in someone than that. And so I do feel a little bit guilty about that in some way, but nonetheless, that's what finally was the turning point for me. I said, okay, I'll join the church. And I contacted one of the two missionaries that had been working with me, his name was Elder McAllister. He's actually from, I think he was originally from Colorado. But I said, okay, I'm willing to do the baptism. Let's set up a time. And sure enough, on the 26th, the baptism was conducted, and the main thing that stuck out to me that day, and this in a way, the main thing that stuck out to me was my dad. because me and my dad, we really haven't had a very good relationship for the most of our lives. I mean, it was so bad to the point to where me and him hadn't talked in months. We show up at family gatherings. Hey, how you doing? That's about it. We can maintain, but we hadn't talked and we hadn't got along. We don't have that great father son relationship. And on the day of my baptism, I remember seeing my dad show up, and despite the fact that we couldn't spend the same room with each other for 5 minutes without tearing each other's heads off. But that day I saw him smile, genuinely smile for the first time in probably 10 years at me. And I said, wow, that's really powerful right there. And after the baptism, me and my dad and my mom, we went to go get some dinner. And it wasn't on a Sunday, so we could still go out to eat, because we weren't forcing anyone else to work. But we went out to go get some dinner, and me and my dad had a normal conversation for the first time in probably since I was a child, since I was 7 or 8 years old. Me and him, like, I'm 26, and me and him hadn't had a normal conversation since I was probably 10. So for the first time in more than a decade, more than 10 years, we were able to have a normal conversation, and I saw him genuinely smile at me for the first time in 10 years. And so that was, now that I look back on it, that was really a miracle, that almost in an instant, the power of God and Jesus was able to repair the relationship between me and my dad, almost instantly. I mean, there's still some work to be done, but it broke down a wall that hadn't been built up for 10 years in an instant, that day. And excuse me, but so that's really my testament of how I got to the church, why I believe the church is true, how I came to that conclusion, and my firsthand witness of the power of the baptism and the authority that the Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints has. And that's where I'm going to leave it. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cody. No, that's a remarkable story. Thank you so much for your willingness to share that.
Thank you.
We're now going to hear from another one of our converts. She's been a member of the church for a few months, but we're going to turn the time over to Carol Brown. I have the blessing of knowing Sister Brown. She's near us in Edmond, but very happy to turn the time over to you, Sister Brown.
Thank you. Thank you, President Christensen and his wife. I'm glad to see you both and to see everyone who is participating this evening. I really hardly know where to start. I will say that I want to give you just a little bit of background about myself because I grew up in the church. When I was born, my parents were Methodist, and so I grew up in the Methodist church. After graduating from high school, I went to a Catholic school, and during that time, I started going to Mass with the Catholic students. I didn't have to, they did. They complained, I didn't, because I wanted to learn what they were doing and to see what they were doing. And during that time, I became Catholic and have spent probably most of my religious experience within the Catholic Church. And I'm shortening that because it could go on a little longer, but baptized on November 14th of last year. Prior to that time, I really didn't know anything about the Mormon church. I knew it existed, and I worked with a lady who was a member of the Mormon church, but she was the only person that I ever knew who was a Mormon. I have a son. He is grown, and a few years ago, a couple of years ago, I guess, my son started dating a lady who was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He became interested, and in the process of his interest, the missionaries would come and talk with him and talk about the church in the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith. And in that process, I would hear some certain things that they were saying. And so I started asking questions because I thought that was really interesting and I wanted to find out more about the church. Well, as time went on, my son did marry and he was baptized in the church, and I attended his baptism and also attended some of the sacrament meetings with him and his family. And I thought, this is really interesting. It's different from anything else, any other religious group that I have encountered from the standpoint of the organization, how things were done. And these are some of the things that I guess that I look at more than anything else. But it's a very organized body of believers. But I continued to talk with my son and ask him questions. Now, needless to say, he also grew up in the church. But at a certain point in time, he kind of dropped out and wasn't too interested in attending the Catholic masses. And I really couldn't understand that. However, once he became a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he really got involved and he really put his heart into everything that he did. And so now I'm really interested to see what is it about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that is so different. So neither my son nor his new wife tried to convert me. That was not their purpose. They rarely talked about the church in and of itself and belonging, but I was always invited to be there if I so chose to do that. So what I did was really sit back and watch them. They had daily prayer and family time together. That became a testimony to me. And the beautiful thing about that was it wasn't just that they were reading scripture or reading any material, they actually lived the word. And that became so very important to me to actually see people who not only read and believed, but actually read it. And honestly and truly, my experience in the church has been that the people I have met and come in contact with are all caring, compassionate, loving people who live the life that I believe Christ would want us to live. So that was really important and significant to me. But I began to ask my sons questions about the church, and it became interesting that he would answer them, or he would say, well, ask Christy because she knows more about the church than I do. And so I would ask her, and she would certainly answer me. We went on, and I spent some time with them on Sundays in their homes, in prayer time, in the evenings. I was invited to attend or participate in the annual conference, probably the year before I was baptized. And my son and his wife came over and we sat through the annual conference. That's not something I would probably ordinarily do, but I enjoyed the whole thing. They stayed half the day. I watched the conference all day because I was so drawn to the compassion and the love and the sincerity that I felt uh, in President Nelson. I could listen to him probably every day. He is such an uplifting person for me. But I participated in that and I enjoyed it so much. So that all of these things are working together now. This was not my decision on my own to say, yeah, I guess I'll go ahead and join. That's not what happened to me. I believe that all of the incidents that occurred during that time were spirit led. I believe that. I believe in the Holy Spirit, and I believe the Spirit leads us to do the right things. And so that's what was going on in my life. Several months, I guess a few months after my son and Christy were married, I started having back problems. And so Steve said, well, why don't you go to a chiropractor and let him take a look at you? And I said, yeah, I probably need because my back is really bothering me. And so he recommended the chiropractor that the two of them saw, Dr. Babcock. And you probably know Brent Babcock. But even if you don't, I did go to Dr. Babcock. Nicest guy. He was just really, really nice. And I would go once or twice a week, and he would work on my back. And I continued to do that. But during that time, he started talking about the church, and I started asking him questions. He took time out of his busy schedule. Once his practice finished for the day, he asked to come and they talked with me. The significant things that I learned during that time was the plan of salvation. The plan of salvation has meant more to me probably than a lot of things that I have heard throughout my religious experience. It was so meaningful to understand that we had pre-life before we got here, and then we came to earth. And there is a way that we are to endure this life here on earth through our baptism, through our faith, through repentance, and through the Holy Spirit. Now, you may say, well, is that important? Yes, it was important to me because having grown up in the church, I had heard there is, you live and then you die. But nobody could ever actually tell me to expect after we die. What is their life after death? And I don't know that anybody has been able to explain that to me. But they could through the plan of salvation, and being a very visual learner that I apparently am, they really mapped that out for me so that I see when we leave this world and go to the other side of the veil, we go to the spirit world. There is a place for us there. That was significant for me. And we are in the spirit world until the resurrection and judgment. And then there are three other places that we can go: the celestial kingdom, the terrestrial kingdom, and the telestial kingdom. That was significant. And that was probably one of the most significant things that I have ever heard during that time, because I have remembered that. I have even shared it with um, my friends who are not uh, members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and that has helped them as well to really put some understanding to what happens to us when we are no longer present on this earth. And I could go on and on with that. But the interesting thing, and I'll go back to say that I'm spirit led to be here, and I believe that because after my baptism, I didn't have any more back pain. And I guess that cured me. My baptism maybe cured me, but I didn't need to go to see Dr. Babcock anymore. It was it was finished, and I haven't had any back pain since then. So that's just one of those things that I wanted to share because I know God has a plan for all of our lives. I believe that. And my being in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not by accident. All of the things that have gone on, that have transpired to get me to where I am today, a part of God's plan for my life and for life after I'm here on earth. Uh, Being a part of this church has become a real process for me. I have grown spiritually. I am more attuned to the Holy Spirit. And I just have a closer feeling with God since I have been there. I met a lot of really caring. In fact, everybody I have met that has been a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, everyone that I have met has been caring and compassionate and loving and friendly. It's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. Two of the things that I have recognized since I have been in the church is that family is so important to the church. And because of that, I have started working with Sherry Ferber on Family Search and Brother Bailey and learning more about my family. It is absolutely amazing. I used to have some friends that say, yeah, I'm doing my family tree. And I would think, well, what are you doing that for? And they just, well, I just want to know. And now I'm really excited about doing it. It's a long, tedious process, but I have learned so much that I didn't know about family. And the good thing about this is that learning about family, finding out about your family, you have the opportunity to spend eternal life with your family and God and the Holy Spirit and Jesus Christ. That's real significant that we can live eternally with our family members. One of the things that I so look forward to doing is going to the temple. I've been to the temple one time. It was before I became a member of the church when the temple in Surrey Hill was open. They had an open house there, and I went, and it is the most peaceful, spiritual place I have ever been. And I look forward to doing that temple work that we're supposed to do. I look forward to being able to just go and sit. If I could just go and sit in the temple, I would probably go every day because it's an experience that I really can't explain. But it's there. The peace and the joy that I feel from being there is definitely unexplainable. Um, I don't know, we might be running out of time. And so I don't want to keep going on and on. I could talk about family and the beliefs and what I see people live in the church. And that is probably one of the most important things because I honestly and truly see people trying to live that life that Christ would have us live. They are some caring and compassionate people. And I feel that I am really blessed to be a part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'll tell you, I did not know until when my son joined. I didn't say anything to him, but I did say to Dr. Babcock once, I said, I didn't know there were any people that look like me in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His response to me was, well, your son's a member. And I thought, oh my gosh, he just joined. But Gladys Knight is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then my daughter-in-law gave me a book. Uh, and she has told me that there are a lot of Black people that are members of the church. But that didn't even matter to me because I love what I see, I love what I hear, and I am blessed to be a part of this church. And I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Sister Brown and Brother Ellen. Just absolutely no question that I have that each of you make us a better church. As we say, the Savior makes us better people, better individuals, but you help us become a better church because of what you bring and the gifts you bring. So thank you so much for that. Sister Christensen, closing.
I just want to thank Carol and Cody for their words. I'm always so touched when I hear these new members, our new friends that have joined the fold.